Well, hi, good morning, good afternoon, wherever we are. My name is Caroline Hall, and I was asked to come here to be part of your wonderful program about mental health and awareness. And when I was first approached, I thought, oh, great, breakout sessions. We're going to have kind of a cozy, intimate, circle-type, interactive experience. And then they said, no, more of a presentation, and then questions and answers. I thought, well, I better bring something here so that you have a visual to look at. Why I'm here is, though, to talk about what is extremely important right now, which is our mental health. Certainly with COVID and the political world and all that's happening around us, we are stressed. My business, I'm in private practice, has never been stronger. That's a good thing, but it sure indicates what's going on in our society. I also had a moment to look at what my presentation was supposed to be on, and it says something about tips and tricks or something like that. So I'll make sure I get that. But I'm really here to represent a wonderful program here in Grand Rapids called the Anxiety Resource Center. And because I'm a facilitator there, we do lots of educational series. So I brought some slides from various different programs I put together over the year. And hopefully there will be some tips and tricks in there. But really what I want to do is educate you about my specialty, which is anxiety, certainly depression, anger, substance abuse. We'll address that just a little bit, but I'd rather highlight what I know. So here we go. The reason I titled this Faces of Anxiety is that we can experience an anxiety, you've probably heard of like generalized anxiety disorder, but maybe you didn't realize that this can also be part of bipolar disorder or a personality disorder, a substance abuse disorder. So it really is the river that flows through all different kinds of disorders. We're going to talk about different ways to treat anxiety. I could spend 3 hours up here, so I'll just give you a few highlights to that. But here we go. So taking a closer look. Let's talk about what anxiety is. Definition: state of apprehension, uneasiness, and tension. So what is a disorder? It's a disturbance of normal functioning. You can read further beyond that. But when does it become an anxiety disorder? Let's see if this is working. Oh, there we go. When it becomes a chronic condition, creates distress leading to interference in a person's ability to lead a normal life. It's not a disorder unless it's a disorder for you. So, for example, I have 2 kids with OCD, and they know I'm a therapist. I'm like, do you want help with that? No, Mom, we're good. So they function quite well. But really, it's how much it interferes with the functioning of your life. And if you've ever heard of the DSM-5, which is like the Bible for therapists, we do have criteria that has to be met in order to have an official diagnosis, which is very important because your diagnosis drives your treatment plan. Insurance certainly requires it as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about this as necessary. But let's talk about this book right here. So why am I bringing this up? Because anxiety disorders used to all be lumped together. PTSD used to be there. OCD used to be in there. Now, if you read through those, that is what would be considered an anxiety disorder. Some of those look pretty familiar, but I don't think people realize that there can be anxiety due to a medical condition, a substance abuse or medication induced. People rarely think that selective mutism is in there. So just a little bit of background here. OCD, which used to be under the umbrella of anxiety disorders, is now in its own group, obsessive compulsive spectrum disorders. This is where you can see trichotillomania, pulling your hair, OCD, body dysmorphic. We'll touch on some of those as well. Sometimes it likes me and sometimes it doesn't. PTSD used to be under the umbrella of anxiety disorders, and now it's in its own trauma and stress-related disorders. There we go. Tourette's, eating disorders, autism spectrum disorders. I'm bringing this up only because anxiety, again, runs through all of these. It would be rare to find somebody on the spectrum that doesn't experience acute anxiety. That's where they get their meltdowns, actually. And if people aren't aware that they're really responding to a world that they are finding hard to navigate because of their neurological brain circuits. It's really hard to address if you don't realize that their meltdowns are very anxiety-based. So we'll touch on that a little bit as well. Comorbidity, if you've never heard that, this means anxiety can coexist with another disorder. And as you can see, oftentimes they are comorbid with, well, depression, I would say, would be the number one. It's most usually diagnosed in addition to. There we go. A few facts. We could spend a whole hour on statistics, but just, I think what's interesting is that 18% of adults diagnosed. That means diagnosed. That means I came in my office or a doctor's office and actually got an official diagnosis. I would say, first of all, who do you not know that struggles with anxiety? But when does it become a disorder? When is it actually diagnosed and meets this criteria? So that number, in my opinion, is extremely low. What is promising, though, is it's extremely treatable. Unfortunately, though, as you can see, only about 36% of people will actually come in and get treatment. And certainly with the disparity of access to health care, that's unfortunate. There is a higher ratio for females to males. We could debate whether that's true or not. But anxiety is normal until it's not. So when I woke up this morning, I'm like, I've got this presentation. And there's a healthy amount of anxiety. I get my stuff organized, and I make sure I've got my outfit and my presentation ready. But when is it not normal? It's not normal when it interferes, again, with the functioning of your life. So what can happen if somebody has panic disorder? They will probably have experienced anxiety to such a degree that their heart is pounding, they feel dissociative, they are avoiding places, etc. So that's when I come in as a therapist to say, well, let me do a little bit of probing to see if this is a disorder or just normal anxiety. So before we look at the handout that you have here on what are the signs of anxiety, believe it or not, there really is a profile for people with anxiety. They're often people pleasers. They avoid conflict. They have difficulty setting boundaries. They're perfectionists. I see some of you going, that's me. There's a good part of this, right? It's very good that you could be a perfectionist. But if I'm going to talk about tips and tricks and ways to deal with anxiety, as a therapist, I will say, how good are you at setting boundaries, saying no, entering conflict? How good are you at understanding there's a difference between perfectionism and high standards, and what do you do if your world is just black and white? I'm perfect or I'm nothing. So we really do explore that. Anxiety can affect us physically. It can affect our emotions and our thoughts and our behaviors, but it can also disrupt what we do. For example, do we avoid things? So as you look through some of these, physical symptoms are what most people relate with anxiety. They feel their heart pounding. They feel dizzy. They feel jumpy, right? All that thing. So if I'm assessing somebody, I go through this and I ask them about their symptoms. It can impact your emotions, thoughts. You can read some of those, that feeling of doomed, easily distracted, difficulty concentrating. Now you have to remember this could also be ADHD, or maybe you have something else going on. So don't go, oh my gosh, I feel easily distracted. I must have an anxiety disorder. Remember, it has to be a criteria that has to be met in all of these categories. And then finally, disrupt your life. Some people may not feel many of the top two, and then I say, well, tell me about your daily life. And we start to realize they're avoiding social situations. They're avoiding making phone calls. They're avoiding going to the mall. So then we can talk about that as well. And then we get a better idea of what category they might be in. Brooke, if you could go back then to the regular, yeah. So what is stress versus anxiety? I don't want to spend too much time on that, but stress is actually the reaction to a physical, to some event. Anxiety is more the interpretation that you put to that event. I want to talk about the threat system. I didn't make this handout, but this is so important that I educate my clients about what's going on. So if their heart is pounding and their hands are clammy, And I know this looks kind of weird, but what I do is I educate on the fight or flight system, because the amygdala, the part of our brain that says there's danger, the brain has one job, friends, is to keep us alive. So if there's we always say the saber-toothed tiger, right? If it's running after you, you don't want to be using the executive functioning part of your brain. Is this a nice tiger? What should I do? Right? The body says, I'm going to prepare you for fight or flight, and that's why your heart's pounding, that's why your vision becomes acute, that's why the rest of the world disappears. I play tennis, so before I do that, I have to go to the bathroom 3 times. I'm like, what's going on there? The bladder needs to empty to say, we need to be as light as we can on our feet if we have to run. So I explain to them why you have clammy hands and all this. And I also say, by the way, you're not going crazy, and it won't kill you. These are normal reactions to stress. But if you can't find that tiger, if what it is your boss is yelling at you or your friends have left you or something like that, it's, again, our interpretation of the event. By the way, most of my clients come from doctors' offices, meaning they either went to the ER because they thought they were dying and had a heart attack, or they did, which is wonderful now, if you go to your regular physician, they do a quick screening for anxiety and depression. And then once we realize we've ruled out any medical reasons for your symptoms, then they call people like me. So I briefly talked about the amygdala. Just want you to see where it is in the brain. It's a very prehistoric part of our brain that keeps us alive. But I'm going to move on because we don't have much time to talk about that. But I do try to educate about how the amygdala hijacks us. So we call it amygdala hijack. That prefrontal cortex, though, this is where our executive functioning is: insight, hindsight, foresight. When the threat system is activated and we're feeling highly agitated, we cannot engage in this. So if you're feeling stressed, the first thing you want to do is regulate the dysregulated nervous system. And I'll show you some ways to do that. Just a quick cycle of anxiety. We have anxiety, we have symptoms, we start scanning the environment, looking for danger. We do our avoidance on safety behaviors, whether it's not going to the place that triggers that anxiety, brings you short-term relief, but then the cycle returns because you haven't really addressed the problem. People often want to know what the causes of anxiety are. These are just a few. Again, if we had a longer time, I'd go through these. But what I want to do is take the shame out of anxiety. People think something's wrong with me. Well, sometimes it's genetic, environmental, medical factors, just the way our brain is wired, experiential. But the cognitive is where therapy comes in, and we'll talk about cognitive behavior therapy, and that's why I have another sheet here, which we'll do in just a minute. So let's see. I talked about one of the disorders could be medical conditions. A lot of people who have endocrine diseases like hypothyroidism, they feel shaky. They have kind of the symptoms that mimic what you saw on your sheet. So it's really important you go to your doctor and say, is this anxiety or do I have some of these other conditions? By the way, when I'm at the ARC, and we now do our support groups via Zoom, so we have members from all over the country, and the theme seems to be health anxiety. Everybody wants to talk about health anxiety, meaning that, oh my gosh, my heart's beating, I must have a heart attack. But what they notice is that sometimes they've never really experienced anxiety all their life, and then something happens, a car accident, or the doctor said you've got high blood pressure, or something that triggers a health anxiety, and then the brain does what it's supposed to do. It overgeneralizes and says, well, if this is scary and dangerous, because your heart, if it's beating, means there's something wrong. If it's excessively beating, your hands are sweaty or you're feeling dizzy. And so part of therapy is to undo what the brain naturally does, which is it creates a narrative to go with the symptoms. I don't know. I didn't know I clicked this. Substance medication-induced anxiety. So if you see any medications that you are on, and don't forget that caffeine is a substance that can certainly exacerbate anxiety. And toxins, my goodness, we've got to be much more aware of the toxicity in our environment that can also interfere with the brain chemistry. So here we go, in this DSM-5, and I think the last gentleman maybe outlined some of the different types of anxieties. Generalized anxiety disorder, you can see this is just everything worries me, that type of disorder. What if? It's the what ifs. What if this? What if this? What if that? Another type is agoraphobia, fear of public places, avoiding. If somebody had a panic attack, maybe in a restaurant, suddenly all restaurants are off limit. And then the mall becomes too much like a restaurant with the crowds, so now they don't go to malls. Their world gets smaller and smaller and smaller until they can't even go out to get the mail because that's what anxiety does. It can be crippling. So agoraphobia is another form of anxiety. Social phobia, this is probably the #1 disorder, but rarely is it actually treated. People don't realize that, hey, I don't like making phone calls, or I just don't like going to parties. And there's nothing wrong with that. You might be an introvert, but it becomes a disorder when, again, you're not connecting with others because this disorder is so debilitating. Specific phobias, I mean, who doesn't like snakes, right? But you can have a phobia of shoes. You can have a phobia of things that, buttons. I mean, there's some bizarre things out there. But there are therapies for each of these, and that's why it's very important that we get the correct diagnosis. You're not going to treat SAD, social anxiety disorder, the same way that you would perhaps a specific phobia. And moving along, separation anxiety disorder. As I said, this is one that people wouldn't expect to be in this umbrella. Certainly notable for parents to understand that this is very real, and these are these kids that just don't want to go to school, but the underlying cause is anxiety. Panic disorder. So a panic attack is not a disorder, but a panic disorder has to have a panic attack at least once. Whether you ever have another panic attack doesn't matter. It's the fear of having a panic attack. And this is, as I showed you in that one, fight or flight, this is where those classic signs come in. They're always attending to their body, and the internal clues are telling them that there must be danger, and they live in a constant flight or fight experience. And then this is, again, rare, but teachers, when we educate teachers, they have to be very aware of this. It's not that they can't talk, it's that they literally are unable to talk because their anxiety is so high. As I said, anxiety, though, can be the kind of the river that goes through many other disorders. So, again, our assessment is very important to make sure that we are getting the correct diagnosis. Want to mention just a few. So, for example, bipolar is often, you will see anxiety symptoms with somebody with bipolar. Body dysmorphia, that picking one part of the body that just becomes obsessive. Trichotillomania. Autism, I already mentioned that. I love this book. This gal is on the high-functioning spectrum, but she wrote this book to really help one understand that somebody on the spectrum sees the world so differently, and their meltdowns are as its titles from Anxiety Meltdown, to understand the role that anxiety plays in this type of developmental disorder. PTSD, as I said, is no longer in the anxiety umbrella, but this is the most severe of all kinds of anxiety. We often think, oh, you know, you've had to go to war and seen some really tragic events to have PTSD. There's trauma with a big T and trauma with a little t. Trauma is defined by how you respond. So if you have flashbacks of something and it was simply being bullied, not simply, but being bullied at school, again, you don't have to have gone to war to have PTSD. So just thought I'd mention that here. Gender dysphoria, as we are becoming much more aware of the sensitivity we need in addressing people not assuming that everybody is one gender, not assuming everybody is hetero or homosexual. There's a complete spectrum between that. But this, when I worked at psychiatric hospital and the kiddos that were coming in with gender dysphoria, not only suicidal, but their anxiety is through the roof because every day is challenging, trying to navigate a world where they don't fit in. I threw this in here because, well, insomnia, we certainly know that those that struggle with that are often say they have racing thoughts and they can't sleep. And somebody drew this, and I thought it was so funny. Like, we can handle our anxiety all day, but the minute we lie down, it goes right to our brains. Tics is not, again, under the umbrella of anxiety disorders. It's actually neural developmental disorder. But anxiety can certainly exacerbate it. So as a teacher, when I saw kids blinking and doing all kinds of tic-like behavior, if you've ever heard that kind of rapid movement or jerky movement, there's a neurological component, but it can certainly be exacerbated by anxiety. And sometimes this works. We talked about alcohol, well, we didn't, but substance-induced anxiety disorder. So somebody who's really struggling, I mean, it can go both ways. You're drinking because you're trying to numb your anxiety, or it can induce anxiety, depending on what substance you're using. So certainly people that are using cocaine, not a good thing to do, because obviously you're going to have symptoms of anxiety and paranoia. But again, good to have the correct diagnosis so that you are having the correct treatment plan. Personality disorders. If you've ever heard of cluster C, these are the ones that are characterized by anxiety. So just so you know, obsessive compulsive disorder is different than obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Want to make that slight variation because one really is a personality trait. People with a personality disorder with OCD, they really don't see a problem. But people with OCD, they know that their obsessions are extremely invasive and disturbing, and their compulsions are quite elaborate. So treatment for anxiety. What's the best way to manage my anxiety? Well, as I just said, you have to know what type of anxiety you're experiencing. So we already went through this handout, so I'm going to move along here. Here are some tips. That threat system we talked about, your nervous system is dysregulated. In order to be able to be problem solvers, use the prefrontal cortex, we have to relax the body. So why do we focus on breath? Because breath is natural and we know how to do it. You're born breathing, right? But if we become rabbit breathers or we stop breathing, it signals to our body something's off. So if we can almost trick our brain and say, hey, if I'm breathing normally, then there must not be danger. So we do things like 5-finger breathing. So you simply take your hand and you say, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out. Not, right? In, out. By the time you get to 5, the brain says, hey, we've experienced some normal breathing. We can slow our body down. We feel regulated, and the amygdala can be quieter. Grounding techniques, there's all kinds. You can Google grounding techniques, but some are just soothing statements like, I'm okay. Some are, let's go walk outside and barefoot and feel we call it somatic sensations, on our feet to really literally feel grounded. Some are behavioral, putting warm water over our hands. It's really important, though, to know what grounding technique works for you. So once again, you can feel calm in your body and then use the coping skills that you may have learned in therapy. Mindfulness, love that word. You can do the same thing. You Google mindfulness activities. Did not have any here for you, but I'll do a quick one that I think could be helpful. It involves your senses. So you're feeling really dysregulated, you just want to bolt, you don't want to do something that you're supposed to because you're just feeling so anxious. So what you might do is, because it's called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 5 means I'm going to look at 5 things around the room, and I like to use an adjective. I see a red flag. I see a gray carpet. I see or feel, sorry, it's all about seeing. 4 would be 4 things that you can experience, a feeling. So you might say, I feel the tag on the back of my shirt. I feel the tightness in my shoes, and you do 4 of those. And so you can see what we're doing. 3 things I hear, 2 things that I might smell, and 1 thing that I might taste. The reason we do taste is, I say put like a Tic Tac or something really powerful, a starburst in your pocket, because it jolts you kind of back to reality. But if you do this type of mindfulness, which means I'm staying present, my mind is not a time traveler, I'm not going out into the future where anxiety lives, the what ifs, I'm not judging, I am simply aware, and that can be very grounding. So mindfulness is a wonderful therapeutic technique. And then PMR, progressive muscle relaxation, you can look that up as well. But when we are tense, these are people that come into my office, TMJ, where my stomach hurts, right? If you think about it, if I were to punch you in the stomach, you would tense up. So anxiety says you are in danger, and you're like this all day long. So progressive muscle relaxation says, for example, we would take our fist and we would hold it as tight as we could, tight, 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 and then suddenly release it to feel the difference between relaxed and tense. And you do that progressively from your toes all the way up to your head until you feel that difference between this and this. And you don't have to do it in private. I mean, you could do this all day long, not all day, but throughout the day to say, how is my neck muscle? Well, let me tense it and then release it. How am I feeling in my stomach? Well, let me tense it and release it. And it can be a wonderful way, again, to behaviorally regulate your nervous system. Don't have time to go into all the different techniques, but CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, is the #1 most research-based type of therapy. Aaron Beck, back in the 60s, 70s, he worked with depressed clients, and he realized it was their thinking that was causing their problems. So he said, well, if I can change your thinking, I can change your behavior. So we say, I think, I feel, I do. I think something, if I think, oh, the world's a scary place, and I feel anxious, then my behavior is I'm going to avoid going to places I feel afraid. So it's challenging negative thoughts, unhealthy thinking styles, and that's when, Brooke, if you could find this one right here, and you have this as well. Yep, right there. Yours is not in color. We call these unhealthy thinking styles or cognitive distortions. These are some classic ones. So for example, if you're feeling anxious, you're probably a classic catastrophizer. What's the worst that can happen? Or you're I must and should person, and that can be very shaming, guilty, I can't get through the day, that type of thing, because my world's supposed to be perfect. I talked about overgeneralizing. If you have a panic attack in a restaurant, you might have one someplace else, because the brain is brilliant. It knows that if something happened here, I'll make a connection. All or nothing thinking, that black and white thinking. Folks, there's gray out there, right? Life is not just this or that. There's always exceptions. So as a therapist, I go through these distortions with my clients so that they have a vocabulary and they can name it. There it is again, my black and white thinking. There it is again, my labeling. If you flip yours over, one of the best things we can do is say, okay, now you know what thinking style you're using, but what are those counter statements that we can come up with? And you can have this. I won't have time to go through these, but one of my favorites is if somebody says, well, I must or I should, and I say, replace that with the word choose. Whether it's I must make my bed, I choose to make my bed. And my teens are like, I should go to college. Well, you choose to go to college. I've run so many groups, and this one gentleman challenged me. He said, well, you must pay your taxes. I said, actually, you don't have to. The consequences will be terrible, but it's a choice. And there's something the brain loves. If I can choose it, it feels not so demanding. So, Brooke, if you could then go back to the presentation. As I said, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these, but DBT is really good for especially people suffering from eating disorders, personality disorders, bipolar disorders. Dialectic means trying to hold two different thoughts in one's mind. So for example, a dialectic thinking would be, hey, I want help, but I won't ask for it. So a therapist would explore that with them. What's going on here that you have these? ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. One of my favorite terms from that is radical acceptance. What's in my control, what's out of my control? If you think about anxiety, it's really feeling out of control. And so you have to ask yourself, what is really in my control? What's in my hands? Can't control the weather, can't control the wars that are happening, but I can control my thoughts, I can control what I'm going to do today. We have an expression, I can't remember who came up with it, but you can feel the feeling, choose the behavior. So I might feel angry, but I don't have to punch somebody. I might feel anxious, but I don't have to avoid. So feelings we're humans, right? We're meant to feel. And feelings are powerful, and feelings are gifts if we know the questions and the answers that we can ask ourselves when we feel that. But choosing the behavior. Nobody can convict you on your thoughts, but your behaviors you can. So ACT is all about exploring that. And let's see, there's some other things. Thought diffusion is also part of ACT. Won't get into that. Exposure therapy. This is what we do when somebody has a specific phobia or OCD. So my kiddos that don't like touching doorknobs, or they're checkers, fact checkers, not fact checkers, they have to check their curling iron if it's on, and their door locks and blah, 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 right? I could do a whole thing on OCD, but the whole thing is the obsession creates anxiety, and the compulsion, whatever they do to stop that fear, is their way of relieving the anxiety. So exposures mean, especially the exposure and response prevention therapy, simply means we're going to take baby steps to not have your obsession and compulsion be so tied together. So let's say that you have a germ phobia and you touch a doorknob and they want to quickly wash their hands, not once or twice, but many, many times. I say, can you go 5 seconds? Oh, that's pretty tough. Oh, that wasn't so bad. Can you go 10 seconds? Oh, it's feeling pretty hard. Okay, go ahead, wash your hands. But you can see we create more and more space. We expose them to their fear, but we don't let them respond. That's what it's called, exposure and response. So again, a wonderful treatment for OCD. I love these. This used to be a different way to do exposure. Flooding is when, let's say you're scared of snakes. I throw you in a vat of snakes, right? I'm just flooding you. There used to be a time that we thought that was okay, but it's unethical and often doesn't work. The way that I showed you, baby steps, exposing yourself to your fears is much better. So there's just some funny things here. I don't know if you can read that, but. Moving on here. Habit reversal training, so I showed you that that's one of the, not anxiety disorders, but compulsive disorders. There's a wonderful information out there. I just saw that on trichotillomania and support groups. But that means their anxiety creates a behavior which is pulling their hair. And a lot of my clients, they come in with hats and missing eyebrows, and it's painful because it's anxiety that you can see. Their behavior has shown that they're not dealing well with it. But the habit reversal training, I won't get into that, but it's another form of therapy to replace the behavior. So if you're pulling out your hair, we'd say you can go this far, but then I'm going to have you pull something else. Or I'll give you another thing. Every time you want to pull your hair, I'm going to have you do a fist like this, so a different habit to replace the urge. Very effective, but takes a trained therapist to work through that with somebody. Exposure therapy, I talked a little bit about that. Psychoeducation, I already told you about the nervous system. But I think it's important that when I'm meeting a client, I make sure they understand, once again, for anxiety, first of all, you're not going crazy. And these symptoms you feel won't hurt you. So I might talk to them about the two different systems in our neurological makeup. I think of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is like the gas, parasympathetic is like the brakes, and every time that we are, the amygdala tells us there's danger, you can see there are so many things that happen on the right side, the sympathetic, yeah, it is your right side. And so the parasympathetic system, how do we engage that? Well, some of those coping skills I told you, the grounding, the mindfulness, the breathing especially, it is engaging the parasympathetic nervous system. Do you ever wonder why we hum when we're nervous? I mean, it's something we do and we probably don't even know why we do that. But when you hum, you are exhaling longer than inhaling. So one breathing technique would be, we'd breathe through our nose, hold it a few seconds, and then we're going to exhale twice as long as if we're breathing through a straw. So it'd be like, if you do that, you can literally feel your heartbeat almost slow down for just a moment. And so humming is another form of kind of that, because if you think about your humming, you are exhaling for a long time. So there's some creative ways that you can activate your parasympathetic nervous system without anybody knowing. Okay, moving on. We talked about breathing, mindfulness. There you go, the 5 things you see, 4 things you feel, hear, smell, and taste. Gotta keep an eye on the time here, folks. I think there was a clock. Oh, it's right there for me. Okay. Meditation. Thousands of years, the Buddhists, other Eastern cultures have known how to get their alpha waves, beta waves, gamma waves, almost to a point of unconsciousness. So if it seems scary and like, why are people, there's some wonderful guided meditation. There are many groups here in Grand Rapids that have classes on it. But what it's really doing is it says a technique for focusing the mind perhaps on an object, breathing, being quiet and still, gently bringing our thoughts back to ourself. So you're sitting there trying to concentrate on a candle, and then we go, oh, wait, I got to pick the kids up from school, and then we gently bring it back to the candle. Again, it's learning to stay present. Yoga, exercise, can't speak enough about that. If your threat system's been activated, you are flooded in marinating in cortisol, which is your life-saving hormone. Great if you need to like lift a car off somebody, right? But it's meant to be short term. But it does take its toll on the body. So every time that glass of milk spills or you're feeling like, oh, there's a big tragedy, say, do I really want to take time off my life? I mean, years off my life. Because cortisol flooding our body constantly, as any doctor will tell you, is it's unhealthy. It can lead to heart disease and all kind of high blood pressure and all that. So why do we do exercise? Because what's the fastest way to metabolize adrenaline but to use it? It also gives us endorphins and keeps our brain and body active. So do not underestimate the power of exercise and yoga. Somatic therapy, I briefly talked about this, but grounding means literally grounding. Some ways to do that, as you can see in this picture, is we have so many senses in our feet, and we wear shoes all day. Next time you take a walk, as long as it's not in some glass or scary, not scary but dangerous path, take your shoes off, and you'll be surprised. Your feet know when to be light. They know where the hot and the cold is. There's all kinds of all kinds of messages coming through your feet to your body. And boy, talk about being present. Talk about being present. You are in the moment. So somatic therapy isn't just walking barefoot, but somebody who might be on the spectrum, who has some real sensory issues, they will help desensitize them using all kinds of techniques to help their body integrate all kinds of sensory stimuli. Okay, so we talked about some of the physical cognitive behavior things we can do as well. What do you think boundary setting has to do with anxiety? Anybody want to just guess why I would ask somebody how good they are at their boundaries and being assertive? Well, let's go back to, how do I feel emotionally safe in the world? I feel emotionally safe when I know who I am. I know my values, I know where I stand. So no matter what happens out there, I know I can protect me. But I can't protect me if I have porous boundaries. What are boundaries? Physical boundaries, I'm sure you know. If I walked up too close to you, you'd be like, whoa, that doesn't feel right. But there's emotional boundaries, intellectual boundaries, time boundaries. And if you're saying yes to all of these, or hey, just walk in my space, we don't feel safe. So a therapist would help you not only identify your boundaries, but whom you need to identify them with. For example, who's in my circle of trust, we used to call it. Some people belong out here, some people belong here. By the way, family does not automatically belong here. So we learn to realize that we have the power to put people or situations at bay as needed. But you have to know where you stand, and that's why we go over values as well. So boundary setting, tips for setting boundary. Brooke, I do have just a quick handout on that if you just want to slide it to the other side. Yep, keep sliding. Oh, not this one. Slide left or right. Yeah, so the one that says boundary setting, if you could just swipe to the right or left with 3 fingers. Yeah, not that one, but that one. Where I end and you begin, this is just some ideas, of tips for setting boundaries. Be clear, don't feel guilty, listen to yourself, things like that. But very important. Okay, now you can go back to the presentation. I know, it's kind of tricky. 3 fingers, swipe left or right. And one more. Yep, there we go. Okay, we're almost done here. So boundary setting, we talk about resilience, perfectionism, values. That all helps us have a better sense of self and who we are and where we stand. We're running out of time, but there are so many medications today that can be very helpful to help minimize your symptoms. The SSRIs, if you've never heard of those are your Zolofts, Paxils, things like that. Serotonin, the one that works on the norepinephrine, which is just another neurotransmitter in our brain. Your doctor would go through all these. There's quick-acting ones, the benzos. These, though, can be habit-forming, should be taken, again, under the extreme caution with the doctor. But they're very effective. If you're having panic attacks, a medication like this could calm you very quickly. So I won't get into all of those, but benzos, that's your Xanax and your Klonopins, other antidepressants. Here's your SSRIs, the Prozacs, the Zolofts, the Paxils. Effexors are in they act on the norepinephrine. Going to move along here. Don't want to educate you. I don't have time to educate you. Here's some alternatives, though. We talked about some of these. Sleep hygiene simply means, do you have a routine for sleep? Like you would a baby. Hey, we take a bath, and then we have a bottle, and then we read a book. There's a routine that can help us do better with our sleep, so we call that sleep hygiene. EMDR is a form of treatment to help, has to do with the left and right side of the brain. You have to be trained in that. But anyway, we need more evidence for those types of things. Mixed evidence, though, if you've heard of the CBD is a form of cannabis, but without the hallucinatory component to it. So that's becoming more researched. Herbs, boy, if you've ever seen them all and say, what's this new supplements and vitamins and herbals? People are starting to really realize there are some organic and natural ways to deal with anxiety. And that's just the CBD, so we'll move on past that. Final words. When we are trying to make a change, whether it's reducing stress, dealing with our depression or anger or anxiety, would you give yourself a little kindness, a little bit of grace? It takes time, it takes courage, it takes action, but change is always possible. And know that, especially in this community, as you can see all the brochures out there, we have so much support for whatever you might be dealing with in your mental health. And I think my final thing is just, here's some books that I find really helpful. But today there's so many books, and you can Google whatever author or topic you want. And I think my final thing was just a picture of, our conversation. So we're running out of time. If you have any questions, I'll be out there for a little bit. Have a great weekend and afternoon. Bye.